The morning of December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda stood aboard the carrier Akagi, watching the second wave of aircraft return from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese task force, which had maintained strict radio silence for a 12-day voyage from Hitokapu Bay, was celebrating an overwhelming victory. They had struck the Americans, crippling the Pacific Fleet by sinking 4 battleships outright, including the Arizona, which exploded violently, and the Oklahoma, which capsized with over 400 men trapped inside, and severely damaging 4 others. In total, 18 ships were destroyed or crippled, and 2,403 Americans were dead. Japan's losses were minimal, just 29 aircraft out of 353 launched, barely 8%. Yet Genda, one of the most brilliant aviation tacticians in the Imperial Japanese Navy and a key designer of the attack under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, stood apart from the euphoria. The numbers running through his head told a story of industrial capacity and logistical calculations that had been catastrophically wrong from the start. Japan had just won a devastating tactical victory while simultaneously guaranteeing its strategic defeat. The problem wasn't the battleships, which Genda knew were becoming obsolete in the face of aircraft carriers and submarines. The fatal oversight was what the Japanese aircraft had not attacked: the massive fuel oil storage tanks on the eastern side of the Pearl Harbor Naval Base. 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, the entire supply for the United States Pacific Fleet, sat in 49 above-ground cylindrical tanks. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later state this fuel was vulnerable even to .50 caliber bullets, let alone bombs. The tanks were clustered together for efficiency, not security. Japanese reconnaissance, including the spy Takeo Yoshikawa, had identified and reported their locations. The tank's thin steel walls, designed only to hold liquid under atmospheric pressure, meant that even a 500-pound armor-piercing bomb would rupture a tank, igniting an intense, persistent fire that would spread across the farm. Destroying all 4.5 million barrels would have been catastrophic for U.S. naval operations. The Pacific Fleet carried less than 1/6 of that amount in its oilers and ship bunkers. Without the shore-based storage, the fleet would have been completely immobilized. Every ship would have been forced to withdraw over 2,000 miles to the west coast, San Diego, San Francisco, or Seattle. Operating from California, a destroyer's operational range in the western Pacific would have been cut in half, crippling the ability to conduct sustained operations west of Midway. American interference with Japanese conquests in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies would have been impossible for at least 12 to 18 months, giving Japan a crucial delay to solidify its gains. The U.S. would have needed years to rebuild the complex storage infrastructure in Hawaii. But the Japanese aircraft never attacked the oil tanks. Not a single bomb was dropped on them. The attack plan did not include the fuel storage as a priority target, and pilots were not briefed on their importance. The bombers focused exclusively on the battleships, big, dramatic targets that masked the true strategic priorities: the carriers, submarines, repair facilities, dry docks, and, most critically, the fuel. This neglect was the result of fundamental miscalculations made during the planning phase. Japan's decision to go to war was driven entirely by oil. The nation imported 90% of its petroleum, mostly from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. The American oil embargo imposed in July 1941, followed by British and Dutch embargoes, cut off more than 80% of Japan's imports. By September 1941, Japan had approximately 50 million barrels in strategic reserves. The Imperial Japanese Navy alone was consuming 25.4 million barrels per year in routine peacetime operations. Adding army and civilian consumption, Japan was burning through its reserves so fast that without new oil sources, it would run out of fuel for military operations sometime in 1943. The choice was either to capitulate to American demands or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies before the reserves ran dry. The Imperial Japanese Navy chose war, basing its strategy on three catastrophically wrong assumptions. First, the war would be short. Planners believed the U.S. would negotiate a settlement after only 6 to 8 months of fighting, unwilling to accept heavy casualties. This meant long-term fuel sustainability was not a factor in calculations. Second, Japanese naval operations would follow the decisive battle doctrine of 1905, where the fleet would wait in home waters for the American Pacific Fleet to steam west for 1 or 2 major engagements. This assumption meant most ships would be at anchor, consuming minimal, manageable fuel. Third, capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields, which produced 65 million barrels per year, would solve Japan's supply problem permanently, providing more than enough oil to meet military consumption estimated at 35 to 40 million barrels annually. Based on 50 million barrels in reserve and the prospect of 65 million barrels per year production, the mathematics appeared sound. The reality was devastatingly different. The war was not short. The American response to Pearl Harbor was furious determination, leading to a conflict that lasted 3 years and 8 months. Japanese naval operations did not follow the decisive battle pattern. Instead, the Pacific War became one of continuous, high-intensity operations across vast distances. Raids, extended patrols, and amphibious assaults. Combat operations consumed fuel at maximum or near maximum speed, meaning consumption rates were 3 to 4 times higher than peacetime planning assumptions. A destroyer on combat deployment could burn as much fuel in a week as it normally consumed in 3 to 4 weeks of cruising. Multiplied across the fleet, the total consumption quickly exceeded planning estimates by enormous margins. Actual Japanese military consumption in fiscal year 1942, April 1942 to March 1943, totaled 41.79 million barrels, at the high end of their entire war estimate, and reached 44.99 million barrels in fiscal year 1943. Japan was burning oil at rates that exhausted reserves far faster than anticipated.
Capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields did not solve the supply problem. When Japanese forces swept through Borneo, Sumatra, and Java in early 1942, they found the oil infrastructure extensively sabotaged by Allied defenders. Wells were set on fire, pumping stations were dynamited, and critical refinery components were removed and buried. Restoration required skilled technicians and specialized heavy equipment that Japan did not possess in sufficient numbers. Due to security and logistical issues, Japan had to send its own scarce petroleum engineers and ship replacement equipment from the home islands, further stretching their already thin merchant shipping. As a result, production struggled. Pre-war production in 1940 was 65 million barrels. In 1942, after the invasion, production reached only 25.9 million barrels, less than 40% of the assumed amount. The shortfall of nearly 40 million barrels was oil that simply did not exist for the war effort. Although production improved to 49.6 million barrels in 1943, by then a third catastrophic error had taken hold: the tanker shortage. Japanese strategists had not adequately calculated the shipping capacity required to transport oil over 2,000 nautical miles from Southeast Asia to Japan, nor how vulnerable that shipping would be to American submarine warfare. A single typical tanker could theoretically deliver about 975,000 barrels annually. To transport the 49 million barrels produced in 1943, Japan needed about 50 dedicated tankers in continuous operation, plus spares for other duties. In December 1941, Japan possessed only 49 suitable ocean-going tankers, a number catastrophically inadequate for a distant war. Japanese shipyards prioritized combat vessels over unglamorous tankers. Meanwhile, American submarines systematically targeted Japanese logistics, making tankers a priority. Every tanker sunk not only reduced transport capacity, but forced remaining tankers to make more trips, increasing their time at sea and exposure to attack, creating a death spiral. Morale plummeted, and captains began taking longer, circuitous routes to avoid known submarine killing grounds like the Luzon Strait. By late 1942, oil imports began declining, not because production was falling, but because the shipping to transport it was disappearing. Oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo and Sumatra, with no ships to move it. By April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the mathematical reality was undeniable. Reserves had dropped from 50 million barrels to 38 million barrels. The Navy alone was consuming 2.4 million barrels per month, significantly above planning estimates. Admiral Yamamoto, preparing for Midway in May 1942, received reports that at current consumption rates, Japan would exhaust its oil reserves sometime in 1943, possibly as early as mid-year. Emergency proposals were desperate and flawed. Building more tankers meant sacrificing needed combat vessels. Reducing operational tempo to conserve fuel meant ceding initiative to the Americans, trading one form of defeat for another. Moving the fleet closer to the oil source, basing battleships near Borneo, saved tanker capacity but kept the fleet thousands of miles from the decisive Central Pacific battles. Burning unrefined Borneo crude oil as bunker fuel saved transportation but caused rapid boiler failures and maintenance problems, degrading fleet readiness. By mid-1943, reserves had dropped to about 15 million barrels. The structural deficit was irrecoverable. Japan needed approximately 40 million barrels per year minimum to sustain military operations. But after accounting for transportation losses, it could import at most 20 to 25 million barrels per year. With domestic production adding only 3 million barrels, the structural deficit was 12 to 17 million barrels annually. This gap could not be closed. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carriers operated at the extreme limit of their fuel range, unable to maneuver freely. American carriers, supported by a massive logistics train of fleet oilers, had virtually unlimited fuel and complete operational freedom. The difference was mathematics. By late 1944, oil imports had collapsed almost completely. Many surviving ships sat in port with empty bunkers. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Japanese made a desperate sortie that consumed most of their remaining fuel, effectively immobilizing the fleet afterward. The final sortie of the battleship Yamamoto to Okinawa in April 1945 was explicitly ordered as a suicide mission with minimal fuel. By August 1945, oil reserves were exhausted. The combined fleet was immobilized with empty bunkers, and the oil produced in the Dutch East Indies sat in storage tanks with no tankers left to transport it. Japan had fought the entire war under a fuel deficit that existed before the war started. Admiral Yamamoto had known this from the beginning. In a letter to the Navy Minister in January 1941, he stated clearly that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States due to the vast industrial and oil imbalance. He never believed Pearl Harbor would achieve a decisive strategic result, but institutional culture suppressed dissent. Officers who raised objections were seen as disloyal, and speaking uncomfortable truths was career suicide. So the people who understood the mathematics stayed quiet, and the people who did not understand the mathematics made the decisions. Even Genda knew on December 7th that even if the fuel tanks had been destroyed, the outcome would not have changed. Japan still did not have enough oil to win. The outcome was determined by the mathematics that existed before the first bomb fell. Japan needed 40 million barrels of oil per year, but had access to only 25 to 30 million barrels per year. The 10 to 15 million barrel per year deficit was a mathematical inevitability that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome. Wars are not won by courage alone, but by logistics and the unglamorous mathematics of resources. The fatal error was going to war in the first place,
based on assumptions about consumption, production, and tanker capacity that were demonstrably wrong. When leaders choose comfortable falsehoods over uncomfortable facts, the result is catastrophe.
If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps us share more forgotten histories that reveal how wars are won and lost not by generals and admirals, but by the mathematics of logistics that everyone else ignores. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold stories. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.